Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the second extended episode of the NT Pod. It's the recording of a class that I gave at Duke University in February 2010 on the Synoptic Problem. This one's dealing specifically with the priority of Mark. I've cut out questions because the microphone doesn't pick those up and any extraneous material that I thought wouldn't come over very well. It begins with me writing on the board and the whole thing lasts about 50 minutes or so.
You'd have thought I've had practice at writing, Mark, wouldn't you? Still can't. That's part of the problem, I suppose. I think I'm signing my name. Right. Matt and Luke. That is Mark and priority. For those listening to the audio, I've drawn on the board Mark and two arrows pointing to Matthew and Luke, which means that Matthew and Luke both use Mark. That's called Markan priority, okay? Now, the main version of Markan priority, according to most scholars, is something which also introduces another document called Q. Now, I'm going to put that in a special box because Q is not like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because Q is hypothetical. These aren't hypothetical documents, they're real literary works which we have witnesses to in our texts. Q doesn't have any witnesses at all in our texts. Now, according to the two-source theory, these are the two sources, Mark and Q. And Q is used by Matthew and Luke, yeah? So that's our first nice diagram, okay? There is an alternative to Markan priority, which we're going to look at, and that's called the Griesbach hypothesis, which I introduced last time, also known as the two-gospel theory. And that theory goes like this. That's the Griesbach hypothesis. What I've done is I've drawn on the board Matthew with an arrow to Luke, which means that Luke used Matthew, and both of them with an arrow to Mark, which means that Mark is using Matthew and Luke. That's called the Griesbach theory. That's Mark third. And it's a theory that helps to explain why Mark is the middle term, because what they say is that Mark conflates the different material in Matthew and Luke. Now, I'm not going to talk about a third theory today. I'm going to talk about that next time. But just so that you've got all of these things on board, let me preview the third theory, which is called the Farrer theory. Now, the Farrer theory is similar to the two-source theory, except it does something quite radical, and it dispenses with Q. Shall I show you how we dispense with Q? You do this. You get the bald rubber, and you go like that. There you go. And we get rid of the arrows that point to Matthew and Luke, and that's how you dispense with Q. Slightly less facetiously, though, what you do is you draw an arrow here from Matthew to Luke. So according to this theory, the Farrer theory, there's no Q, but Luke copies out of Matthew as well as Mark, yeah? And that's the Farrer theory. But we'll talk about that a bit next time when we talk also about Q. The things that I really want to contrast in a big way today are the theories of Markan priority and the theories of Markan posteriority, okay? So Markan priority theories, two-source theory and Farrer, Markan posteriority, Griesbach. Is that making some sense? I should probably have done the diagrams last time. I deliberately chose not to do diagrams last time, and the reason I chose not to is that, as I mentioned before, one of my worries about the way that the synoptic problem is often taught is people go too quickly for the solutions to the problem. And I think if you go too quickly for solutions to the problem, you don't spend enough time getting yourself familiar with the data. Almost all books on the New Testament that touch on the synoptic problem go very, very quickly for a solution to the data. And they don't spend enough time actually discussing the problem itself. That's why I wanted to spend a whole bit of time last time just talking about the problem, the actual synoptic problem. Most people think the synoptic problem is the two-source theory. Okay, let's have a look at why people think that Mark is first gospel. No. Q is entirely a scholarly theory. It's something which is only... Q emerges solely from the study of the synopsis. There's no external attestation to it at all. And there is no ancient author that refers to anything that we think might be Q. That's, in my opinion, this is why I know, you see, that Duke students are so bright, because you always anticipate where we're going next. That's a good thing. That shows that we're on the path together. But you don't have to agree with me when we get to it. You might say, you see, next time, you might say, no, yeah, I think you're right. I think this Q sounds really, really, you know, the thing. But yeah, it doesn't have any external attestation at all, no. It's a scholarly theory. Mm-hmm. It's kind of why it's so exciting. Because if it's right, then scholars have actually dug up from our texts a gospel we didn't know existed previously. And that's exciting. It's like literary archaeology, isn't it? It's like digging beneath the text and discovering something. I mean, I've already told you I don't believe in Q, but I kind of wish I do, because I think it's a really exciting, fascinating theory. Wouldn't it be wonderful if, in looking in the text, we could find, you know, this gem, unearth it, you know? I think that would be fabulous, but I don't think it's there. I think the deeper you look, the more it just vanishes away into nothingness. Anyway, but that's for next time. Markham priority. There are a series of arguments that get made for Markham priority in the literature. Some are strong, and some are less strong. What I'll try and do is give you what I regard as the stronger arguments for Markham priority, which I'm a convinced believer in. Let's go, first of all, with the broad category of additions and omissions. Now, do you remember last time, when we were surveying the data, one of the key things is that Mark has very little special material. It's only a handful of verses. You have things like the man running away naked in the garden. You have another story in Mark 8 called the blind man of Bethsaida. And in the blind man of Bethsaida, it's where Jesus tries to heal a blind man. But he has to have a couple of goes at it. The first go, he tries to heal him, and then he says, "What can you see?" And the blind man says to him, "I can see people like trees walking around," which always is a comedic image to me, because it makes me think of things like the Wizard of Oz. Do you know the Wizard of Oz, where the trees kind of talk and that kind of thing? So the blind man says, "I see people like trees walking around." It's actually a brilliant and fascinating detail, because if you were blind and you suddenly could see again, how would you know what people really looked like? If you talk to blind people, one of the interesting things, even if they're people who were once sighted, they find it really difficult after a while to remember faces and what faces look like. So actually, you might think someone looked like a tree if you came out of blindness into... Anyway, so gets halfway through, tries to heal him, and he can see people like trees walking. And then Jesus has another go, and then he's healed completely. So that's a piece of Markan special material. There's another piece which is about a deaf man, and it's where Jesus puts his fingers in the deaf man's ear and says, "Ephatha," in Aramaic, "be opened." So the very few examples that you've got of special Mark are all of quite an interesting nature. So those three stories that I've mentioned, the healing of the blind man of Bethsaida, the man running away naked in the garden, and the healing of a deaf mute, those three stories are all special Mark stories. So what the Markan priorist has to ask is it more plausible that these are stories that Matthew and Luke would have omitted, both omitted, which would be a Markan priority solution? Or is it more likely that they are special stories that Mark really wanted to add more than anything else? Just imagine yourself in the process of writing a gospel, should you decide to do that. And you sit yourself down and you say, now, I've got 2 or 3 stories that aren't in Matthew and Luke I really want to add. One's about a man running away naked. One's about Jesus healing a deaf man by sticking his fingers in his ears. And another one is about him partially healing a blind man. Would they be the stories you really, really wanted to include? You might do, I suppose, if you had a particular mentality. But most people think it's more likely that they're the stories that Matthew and Luke mutually excluded in their versions of their Gospels. You can see why. I mean, for example, if Jesus is healing someone gradually, it might suggest some limits to Jesus' healing power. if he's a little bit physical, it might be something that Matthew and Luke pulled back from a little bit. And the story about the man running away in the garden, it's difficult to know what that story is really about, so you can imagine again why they would omit it. So the way that scholars work on this is they say it's more likely that Matthew and Luke have omitted these stories than that Mark has added them. Now, if Mark used Matthew and Luke, he omitted huge amounts of what you might call congenial material. In other words, he omitted material that you would, in the round, have expected him to have included. One of the best examples of this is the Lord's Prayer. Do you know the Lord's Prayer? Have you heard of the Lord's Prayer? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name, that kind of thing. That's always the, do you know people always say the Matthew version of the Lord's Prayer? Luke's got a version as well. It's much shorter, and it even begins differently. How does Luke's Lord's Prayer begin? For a bonus point. And you know what points mean? Nothing whatsoever. They just mean kudos, karma or something. How does Luke's Lord's Prayer begin? It just begins with the single word Father. It doesn't have our Father who art in heaven like you have in Matthew, just Father. And that's Luke's standard means of Jesus addressing God, single word Father. But so you've got it in Matthew, chapter 6, you've got it in Luke in chapter 11, but there's no Lord's Prayer in Mark. Now, the reason that that's curious is that in Mark's Gospel, you've got some stuff that's quite like the Lord's Prayer. And in fact, in Mark 11, you've actually got some teaching about prayer in which Jesus talks about how you might forgive one another. And so people say, well, would Mark, if he'd have got Matthew and Luke in front of him, have made a deliberate decision not to include the Lord's Prayer? And most people think it's unlikely, and it's more likely it's something that Matthew and Luke kind of added to their Markan account. In fact, there's a whole sequence in Matthew's Gospel which comes hardly at all in Mark, and it's called the Sermon on the Mount. You might have heard of the Sermon on the Mount. It's one of the most famous pieces of religious literature, ethical literature of all time, Matthew 5 to 7. It's a long speech that Jesus gives, uninterrupted by anything, where he just works through certain things about the law and so on. Very little of the Sermon on the Mount makes it into Mark's Gospel. No Beatitudes, nothing like that. But there's quite a bit of it in Luke. Luke has his own version of it in chapter 6, which is called the Sermon on the Plain. And then he has excerpts from it later on in his long sort of travel narrative between Luke 10 and Luke 18. But you have this big sermon in Matthew, which just doesn't make an impression on Mark as he's writing his Gospel, if Mark is writing third. So a lot of people think it's odd that Mark, on this theory, would have excluded what we would regard as congenial material. And then he adds things which are uncongenial to Matthew and Luke, as we've already seen. Now, the way that I like to sort of draw these points together is under C on handout, the relationship between the additions and the omissions. Because the difficulty for the Griesbach theory is that a consistent picture of Mark's redactional practice doesn't clearly emerge when you look at Mark the redactor if Mark is writing third. Because if you were doing this, if you were Mark, and you're deliberately trying to write a shorter Gospel, one that draws in a lot of material from Matthew and Luke, are those the bits of Matthew and Luke you would have excluded? Would you have deliberately gone out of your way to omit large parts of things like the Sermon on the Mount, at the expense of introducing a story about Jesus putting his fingers in a man's ears? That's the sort of problem that the Griesbach theory has. On the whole, it's not been very good at answering that question, in my opinion. What they will tend to say is that Mark is trying to produce a kind of a new conflated gospel. And William Farmer, who I mentioned last time, talked about Mark as an irenic person, a peaceful person who was deliberately trying to draw together lots of what's common in Matthew and Luke. But he was never really very good at explaining why Mark didn't include a lot of the material which is there in Matthew and Luke. You remember that there's this whole category of double tradition material. The double tradition material on the Griesbach theory is the material that Matthew and Luke... Sorry, the double tradition material on the Griesbach theory is the material that Mark omitted. So with every piece of double tradition material, you have to say, could you imagine someone doing that at the expense of adding the other material that he did? And it's not just that it's not just on the level of individual pericopes that he's adding, but it's also on the level that when there are certain pericopes, Mark massively expands them. So on the Griesbach theory. So for example, the story of the Garrisoned Demoniac in Mark 5, which is a great story about how Jesus heals this man of demons, a legion of demons, by throwing them out into pigs, and the pigs then run off the side of a cliff and into the sea and get drowned. Fantastic and bizarre story. That's a really long story in Mark, 20 verses. Matthew's version is really short. Luke's version's quite a bit shorter. So what you have to imagine Mark doing on the Griesbach theory is he says, oh, that story about the pigs, that's an absolute cracker. We need more of that, right? And he might have been like that, but it means that he's kind of a bit perverse, because he's deliberately saying, I want more pigs and less ethics, right? You know, because the stuff he misses out is all that great ethical material in the Sermon on the Mount and other similar stories. It's possible, but people think it's kind of a bit unlikely. Because people in antiquity did make epitomes, did try and make condensed versions of things. But if Mark was like that, someone who wanted to write an epitome, someone who wanted to write a condensed version of something, why did he do it the way he did, by adding such huge and interesting and bizarre details, interesting to us? So the picture that you begin to draw of Mark on the Griesbach hypothesis is harder to understand than the one which you begin to draw on the basis of Markan priority theories. Probably the best place to go for a full understanding of the Griesbach picture of Mark as a redactor is a relatively recent book called One Gospel from Two. It's written by a group of Griesbachian scholars from the US, David Peabody, David Dungan, Alan McNichol, and, oh gosh, who were the other ones? Tom Longstaff, Philip Schuler. Have I missed anyone? Lamar Cope. And they got together as a team and they worked on a redactional presentation of Mark as a version of Matthew and Luke. In other words, they looked at what was actually involved in Mark gathering together these threads from Matthew and Luke. It's a really important book in many ways, because it helps you to think through the whole process of what would have been involved if Mark indeed was third. And I must admit, although I admire the book in many ways, when I got to the end of it, I said, I'm now more persuaded than ever that Mark was not the third gospel, because the processes involved are actually quite complicated. And just to finish on this business of Mark as the profile of Mark, one of the things that I would add is that the process, when you get to the end of One Gospel from Two, the book One Gospel from Two, it's a very literary process. You've got a Mark who is all the way through the Gospel, doing a kind of literary comparison between Matthew and Luke, pulling a phrase here and a phrase there and comparing things quite closely and reproducing things in this quite literary way. And what is rather odd about that as a process when you're looking at Mark is that of all three synoptics, Mark is the one which is most obviously oral in its flavour. It's the one that seems to have the kind of rawest energy. It's the gospel that has the kind of half-broken sentences. It's the gospel that has "and" all the time. It's the gospel that has the historic present tense. Do you know the historic present tense? It's used less in contemporary American than it is in contemporary British, I think. That means I haven't heard. It may be just I'm not mixing with the right kind of people. But in contemporary British English, people will often, when they're telling a story, lapse into the present tense. So, especially if you're telling a controversial story, or you're wanting to do some gossip. So you go, did you see so-and-so this morning? Yeah, I saw so-and-so. Well, what did they say? Oh, they said this. And then you go, and then do you know what he says? He says this. And so you lapse into the present tense. Does that happen in American English? A little bit, yeah, a little bit. I don't think it's as common as it is in British English. So you're all much better spoken than we Brits. We Brits are really kind of brutish, a bit like Mark in Mark's Gospel. And Mark in Mark's Gospel as well, he keeps using terms like immediately, over and over again, immediately. Mark's Gospel is kind of has a frenetic pace. When we get to Mark, we're going to have 3 sessions on Mark, I think. Are we having 3 or 2? I can't remember how many I said. I think it might be 2, actually. But anyway, when we get to Mark's Gospel, I'm going to ask you all to read the whole Gospel in one sitting. It won't take you very long. probably about an hour tops. And you should be out of breath at the end of it, if you've read it properly. Because Mark is like that, it's breathy and immediate, and it's like, it's like running really fast towards the end of a cliff and then suddenly trying to stop yourself from falling off it. It's like that. It's a fantastically immediate and energetic kind of gospel. Now, given that Mark is like that, very oral kind of gospel, very colloquial, very immediate, very energetic, is that the kind of gospel that looks like someone conflating two literary texts closely? It's possible, but it's difficult to imagine given the mechanics of what's involved with that conflation. So most people think that Markan priority, where Mark is the first gospel, is more plausible. So what happens is, Mark writes this first gospel, a work of, I call it brutish genius. Mark is a brilliant work in many ways. It's dark and it's ironic and it's full of fantastic and drama and enigma and makes you want to keep reading on. And yet, at the same time, it's got all these flaws, like the fact that sometimes he can't finish a sentence, or he uses the word "and" all the time. See, if you, when you hand your midterms in, keep putting full stop and, full stop and, full stop and, right? Oh, you don't say full stop, do you? What do you say? Period. Period and, period and, period and. Did you know we say full stop in Britain? Do you not? Do you know when we watch, in Britain, when we watch American dramas and people go da-da-da-da-da, period, like this, we used to think, what are they on about? But then we realised that it was punctuation. It meant full stop. Right, so back to the point. The thing is, it's terrible. When you start having a digression on the digression, it gets difficult, doesn't it? But I'm up to the task, don't panic. When in Mark's Gospel, no, not when in Mark's Gospel, still on the analogy. When in your midterm, if in your midterm you were to go, period and, period and, period and, what am I going to say? Too many ands, right? That's what you'd say if you were marking Mark's Gospel. You might say, well, I'm looking at my text, it hasn't got that many ands in it. Do you know why? Because the translators miss lots of them out. Isn't that awful? It's mean of them, isn't it? They should tell you what's in the Greek, shouldn't they, yeah? That's why you have to learn Greek eventually, because you just want to know what's there, don't you? But anyway, yeah, and also, one of the things that a lot of translators do, those historic presents I was talking about, where Mark uses the present tense to talk about the past, on those occasions, quite often, Mark is translated by his translators with a past tense. So, unfortunately, you don't always get the flavour of it when you're reading the translation. Sometimes you do, it depends on your translation, and that's why it's good to compare different translations. So anyway, that's some stuff on additions and omissions and the business of what Mark looks like as an evangelist on Markan priority and on Markan posteriority. And it's why I'm a convinced believer, it's one of the reasons I'm a believer in Markan priority. Any questions on that point before I go on to the next one? It's one of the major points there, I think. When you get people from the Griesbach hypothesis answering this point or attempting to answer it, they usually answer it piecemeal. So they'll say, well, I can think of reasons why Mark would have added these bits, and I can think of reasons why he would have omitted these bits. But what they don't look at, on the whole, is the profile of Mark that emerges as an evangelist, as a redactor on that theory. Okay, so 3 harder readings. I'm not going to spend too long on this point, because I think it's easy to make too much of it, but I'll at least mention it, because it has been important in the literature. This point is quite a straightforward one. It's that Mark, out of the 3 synoptic Gospels, often has what people describe as the harder reading, by which they mean that if you compare Mark with Matthew and Luke, Mark will say something where it makes you raise your eyebrows and go, whoa, why has he said that? I've put 2 of the most famous examples on the handout. Example number 1, Mark 10:17 to 18. And as he was setting out on a journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." Why is that a harder reading than Matthew's parallel, which just says, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" Matthew's parallel in Matthew 19, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" Why is that Why is the Markham version harder? Right, yeah. It could be construed as saying that Jesus is not good, that he's not God. It's a really strange answer, isn't it? Why do you call me good? I mean, you expect the answer. Well, it's odd to have that sort of announcement from Jesus. Interestingly enough, though, it is in Luke. So it does make you think, well, Luke didn't obviously have quite as strong an objection to it as Matthew did, because Matthew adjusts it on the theory of Markham priority. And that's why, personally, I don't put as much stress on this argument as on some of the others, because I feel that when people make this point in the textbooks, they regularly don't look at the fact that Luke does have this verse. It's a really interesting question. How long did Matthew and Mark spend writing these Gospels? I'll answer it with an analogy. Not an analogy. I'll answer it with an anecdote. When I do PhD examinations or vivas or oral defences or whatever, I always ask the candidate, or almost always, how long do you think, if it's on the Gospels, how long do you think Luke spent writing his Gospel? Or how long do you think Matthew spent doing it? Because sometimes PhD students who spend 4 years obsessing about something kind of imagine that the Gospel writer spent 4 years obsessing about their text. And maybe Luke spent a week. And the serious point in your question, which is a very astute question. Excellent so far. We've had no dud questions so far, have we? It's excellent. So that could be a challenge for some of you. Let's see if I think of a really rubbish question. But yeah, I mean, it's an astute question because, let's say for the sake of argument, it took Luke 10 years to write his Gospel. That might mean that he took it through a few drafts, right? And we know from the way that the ancients wrote in antiquity that quite often they tried things out at dinner parties and gatherings and this sort of thing. So I think Luke probably tried the Gospel out on people first. And someone said, oh, hold on a minute. Have you got any reference there to Jesus' birth? Because, Matthew's birth. Yeah, or, and then, or maybe not. I mean, so, yes, good question. And my answer is I have no idea. I'll tell you what I imagine. I tend to imagine that Luke took a long time. And I tend to imagine that Mark didn't take very long at all. I think Mark probably spent a couple of days. And sorry, carry on. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think that's a really excellent point. And bloggable. Yeah. Doesn't mean I will blog it, but it's potentially bloggable. Yeah, I think that it's very easy to imagine that the evangelist spent ages obsessing about it, and I think it's one of the reasons why sometimes, we've talked about having a historical approach to the text. Sometimes having a historical approach means reading the text without thinking too heavily about them as sacred texts, because I think one of the dangers about looking at these as sacred texts, and of course they are sacred texts, lots of people venerate these texts, and I'm not in any way knocking that, but one of the dangers about looking at these as sacred texts is it's easy to think that every single word has this kind of packed-in importance, and sometimes you're absolutely right. Luke might have just said, sounds good, might not even have thought about it, might have been an off day, or an off 10 minutes, yeah? I mean, some of my writing's better than others, right? Some of your writing's probably better than others, right? Unless you've got A's for every course at Duke, right? Some is going to be better than others. Maybe that's like that with the evangelist. Excellent point. The other example of a harder reading that I've put on the handout is from Mark 6, verse 5. It's the end of the story of the rejection in the synagogue at Nazareth, where Jesus has a hard time. They give him a really hard time. He's gone back to his hometown. And Mark doesn't actually name it as Nazareth. He just calls it his home place. And he goes back there. And he starts preaching and so on, and they start giving him a really hard time. And they start going, who is this guy? That sort of thing. And then at the end of the story, Mark says, he could do no miracle there. Let me get the exact quotation. Except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them, and he wondered at their unbelief. Now, lots of people say that Mark there, by saying he could do no miracle there, has the harder reading than Matthew, because in Matthew's Gospel, you have he did know miracle there. So in Matthew 13, it becomes like a choice that Jesus makes. He chooses not to do any major miracle there because of their unbelief. Whereas in Mark, there's again a kind of a limit on his power. Now, the Lucan parallel in Luke 4 doesn't have this verse at all. So this is like a kind of more of a proper example of a harder reading. Again, I'm not inclined to put too much stress on this point because it's kind of down to the minutiae. of a decision that Mark or Matthew may have made. And sometimes people do make odd little decisions on particular occasions, but it's an interesting case in point, isn't it? You'll find when people discuss the synoptic problem, there'll be a bunch more examples of these kind of things, where Mark apparently has the more difficult reading. Okay, two more reasons why I find Markham priority more plausible than Markham posteriority. The first of them is something we've already touched on in the third class on dates and authors of the Gospels, and this is a question of the dates of the Gospels. A key moment in Jewish history comes with the fall of Jerusalem in 70. And lots of scholars say, well, if the Gospels are written after 70, you'd expect that traumatic event to have made some sort of impact on the Gospels. And the interesting thing is that Matthew and Luke have much clearer, more explicit, apparent references. It's awful saying explicit, apparent, but the references to the fall of Jerusalem appear more detailed and more precise in Matthew and Luke than in Mark, which may suggest that they come a little bit later than Mark. So, for example, Matthew 22:7, the king was out. This is in the middle of a parable. He has a parable, Matthew does, of the wedding banquet. And he says, the king was angry and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burnt their city. And it feels like a really strange moment in the parable, which may well be informed by the recent burning of Jerusalem. Or you look at the text in Matthew 23 and Luke 13, behold, your house is forsaken. And that term about the house being forsaken, the very word is used by Josephus, the Jewish historian, when he's looking at omens and portents about the destruction of the temple. And then Luke, when he has his version of the apocalyptic discourse, which is his version of Mark chapter 13, Mark 13 paralleled in Luke 20, when you look at Luke 20 as compared with with Mark 13, you can see details that make much better sense if Luke is trying to conform the words of the prophecy more closely to what actually happened in 70, especially the line, and Jerusalem will be trodden down by the Gentiles, and various other lines that are similar. I think this is one of those points I would only bring in as supporting evidence. I don't think it's strong enough to make the case overall. And I indicated in our third class that I feel that Mark's Gospel itself makes better sense after 70. It's just that these later texts, Matthew and Luke, seem to be trying to make the references to Jerusalem even more precise. That's as far as I would want to take it. I don't think this is a very strong point. I just think it's a general indication of the way that the land lies. Now, all of these points that we've looked at so far have been around for quite a long time as arguments for Markham priority, alongside a whole bunch of other arguments which I haven't even brought up here, some of which are actually quite poor, some of which are circular. And when I was doing my graduate work in the early 1990s, I was reading someone, it was William Farmer again, who was saying that he felt that one of the problems with those who argue for Markham priority is that there are no new arguments for Markham priority. He rather, in a frustrated way, and I feel sorry for him in this, he said, well, what's happening is people just recount the same old arguments, the same tired arguments, and don't actually take any account of our Griesbachian answers to them. I think he wasn't entirely right about that, because I think part of the problem was that the answers given by Farmer and other adherents of the Griesbach hypothesis simply weren't as persuasive as they hoped that they would be, and a lot of people just rejected them. But he was right that people hadn't spent enough time trying to develop new arguments for Markham priority. So I'm one who likes a bit of a challenge. So I thought to myself, well, I wonder if I can think of one. Well, I didn't quite think of it like this. I mean, this is kind of retrospective storytelling, isn't it? But I thought to myself in this fictional version of my life, I wonder if, it's only partially fictional, I wonder if I can think of an argument for Markham priority, which no one's thought of before. And my eye was drawn to an argument that was made by Michael Golder, who I'll talk about a bit more next time. And he used a term, fatigue, in particular editorial fatigue, when he was doing his commentaries on Matthew and Luke. And he noted that there were certain points where Matthew and Luke appeared to write in a particular way at the beginning of a pericope, changing their source. But then as their account developed, they would drift into the wording of the source that they were copying. Now, in Golder's work, this was just something that he mentioned almost in passing. He gave little more than a sentence or so to it whenever he saw it happening. But I thought this is a really interesting phenomenon, because if this is really there as a literary phenomenon, it surely demonstrates that Mark is the source gospel for Matthew and Luke. So I decided that what I would do is see if the examples that Golder gave stand up to scrutiny, and also look for counter-examples, and see if we could find examples where Mark could be said to be becoming fatigued with Matthew and Luke. And I'll tell you how I came up with what I came up with in a moment, but I want to dwell on the point for a moment, just so that you can grasp what I'm talking about. And I'll do it by means of analogy. One of my favourite TV series is called Colombo. Anybody ever seen Colombo? It's excellent. I think it's. I think I own lots of it on DVD. I think it is one of the. To our generation, to this generation now, I think it's almost becoming forgotten. So if you've never seen Colombo, do revisit it. I think it goes back for me to the fact that I could remember my parents watching it when I was a child, and there was a kind of level of intrigue where you think, oh, what's this program they're watching? And then as time went on, I went back and revisited it. And then there were kind of new Colombos in the 1990s and late 80s and early 90s, and it was kind of really exciting to come back again, you know. Now, especially with some of the older Colombos, it's enormously good fun to watch them carefully and look for continuity errors. Because they made them at quite a high quality, sometimes almost like quasi sort of feature films. You know, they didn't. Peter Falk always refused to do the whole sort of 20+ episodes a year. He always wanted to do just a handful because he wanted to keep the quality high. But nevertheless, because they were still on a kind of a tight budget and a tight schedule, and because for some bizarre reason they didn't spend enough money on a continuity person, which they always have on these days, it's much harder to spot continuity errors in contemporary film and television for this reason. But because they didn't spend money on that sort of thing, if you watch carefully, you can see all sorts of ways in which there's evidence of the way that the scenes have been kind of edited together, as it were. One of the best things is Colombo smokes a cigar. Again, you'd never have a hero smoking these days on the TV, would you? He smokes a cigar, but sometimes you have this miraculous shrinking and growing cigar. So in a scene, it can go from being thick to thin and then back to being thick again. It's great. There's a particular good example where he's actually sitting in his car. He drives this old, what we would call in Britain a Peugeot, but it's pronounced in America Peugeot, or at least that's how Colombo pronounces it. And you just watch the cigar go down and then back up again. It's great. And another particular favourite of mine is, anyone here heard of William Shatner, famous for playing Captain Kirk? Well, he's a Colombo baddie on several occasions. But one of the best occasions, his moustache keeps changing. And it begins kind of thick and bushy, and then there's a section in the middle where it's kind of pencil thin, and then in the next scene it's back to being thick and bushy again. And it's obvious that they've done some outdoor filming on location, and then they've done the studio filming, and the props person obviously is a different person for the two shoots, and Shatner can't remember. And so he has this miraculous changing moustache, which is lots of fun too. Now, this is what I think is going on in these examples of editorial fatigue. They're kind of like continuity errors in film and television. They're places where you've got a particular bit of source material in Mark's Gospel, and Matthew begins by making changes, but then he starts halfway through getting a little bit fatigued and getting involved in docile reproduction of his source. I'll give you some examples so that I can show you what I mean. First one, from Mark 1:40-45 and from Matthew 8:1-4, is the story of the leper. Now, in the story of the leper, this is relocated in Matthew to after the Sermon on the Mount. In Mark's Gospel, it's much earlier on, and Jesus is in a private place. Now, So when, at the end of Mark's story, Jesus says to the leper, why don't you just, go off, don't tell anybody about this, but go and show yourself to the priest, it kind of makes sense. In Matthew's story, he's changed the opening. Because he's relocated it to just after the Sermon on the Mount, what's happened is there are large crowds, and it's very characteristic of Matthew to keep listing the crowds. So in Matthew 8:1, he talks about the large crowds that were all gathered around Jesus. And then, at the end of the story, copying out of Mark, he says, don't tell anybody what's happened and go and show yourself to the priest. And the reader's thinking, well, hold on a minute, there's all these crowds around. What's the point of saying don't tell anybody? They've just seen this. So what you've got is a kind of a continuity error in Matthew's version of the story. And it's what Michael Golder called editorial fatigue. And I think it's a real pointer in the direction of Markan priority. A second example of the same kind of thing comes in the death of John the Baptist pericope, Mark 6:14 to 29, paralleled in Matthew 14. This is one of these examples where Mark has a much fuller account. Mark's account of the death of John the Baptist is quite a longish sort of account, and Matthew abbreviates it quite drastically. Now, in Matthew's version, he begins by making a really good correction of Mark's account. See, Mark, all the way through, had called Herod King Herod. Now, Matthew, when he sees this, knows that this isn't entirely accurate, because this Herod is a Herod called Herod Antipas, who was a tetrarch, ruler of a fourth, a tetrarch in Galilee. He wasn't actually a king. When you read Josephus, you see that he doesn't actually like to describe Herod as a king. He tends to call him Herod the Tetrarch, Josephus calls him. So Matthew, in the interest of accuracy, does what he often does and tries really hard to get the names of people right. So instead of saying King Herod, he says Herod the Tetrarch. And we kind of think, excellent, that's a little improvement on Mark, right? But then you get halfway through the story, and Matthew's got fatigued, and he calls him the king. He's lapsed into the wording of his source. It's a continuity error because I think he's got Mark in front of him, and he's a little more awake at the beginning of the story than he is halfway through. And there's a more telling thing as well in the same verse in Matthew. Is it Matthew 14:9, I think, is the exact verse, where he says, the king grieved. Now, I need to give you a little bit of background to this to make sense of what's going on with this bit of fatigue. In Mark, where you've got the longer story, Herod really likes listening to John the Baptist, but he's kind of a bit scared of him, but he really likes listening to him. But his wife Herodias doesn't like John at all and wants him killed. And then Herod has this big party, and Herodias' daughter dances for Herod. She's not called Salome in the text. That's something which is added by later generations of people reading the text. She's not named in the text. But Herodias' daughter dances, and Herod's so impressed, he says, I will give you anything up to half of my kingdom. And she says, can I have the head of John the Baptist on a platter? It's a gruesome story, isn't it? And at that point in the story, Mark says, and Herod grieved. The reason that Herod grieves about it is because he likes John the Baptist. He likes listening to John the Baptist, and he doesn't want him killed. Now, in Matthew's version of the same story, it's so drastically abbreviated that he doesn't have any of the stuff at the beginning about how Herod liked listening to John the Baptist. There's no sense of that at all in Matthew's story. In fact, in Matthew's version, you get the picture of Herod and Herodias being equally the kind of bad guys all the way through. So then when you get to the bit where Matthew says, and the king grieved, what you have to say is, why is he grieving in Matthew? You know, he wanted him dead anyway. It's not a big deal. He should have gone, yeah, okay, you can have that. You can have the head of John the Baptist on a platter. You know, but he doesn't. And so I think what's going on there is you've got a little piece of editorial fatigue where Matthew has changed the opening of the story and has drifted into the wording of his source as he's gone through. And in fact, there's even a third thing as well, which is that when Matthew tells the story in Matthew 14, he's telling it as a flashback story. Occasionally you get, you know how these days, if you watch Lost, like, all loads and loads of flashbacks, right, isn't it? We love flashbacks these days, don't we? Now I think we're too obsessed with them. We now just have some ordinary old-fashioned straight narratives, because now people think that a narrative's not proper unless it's got tons of flashbacks in it, right? But in antiquity they did them as well. And Matthew tells the story of the death of John the Baptist as a flashback, but by the end of the story he's forgotten he's telling it as a flashback and just carries on the narrative as if it's just happened. So you have another strange narrative inconsistency, a bit of editorial fatigue that is operating in the text. Now, I think that examples like that make much better sense on the assumption that Matthew has a copy of Mark's Gospel in front of him, rather than the theory that Mark has a copy of Matthew in front of him, right? You then have to ask the question as well, to have Markan priority sustained, you would have to find examples of the same kind of thing in Luke. And interestingly enough, you can find quite a few. If you really want to pursue it, if you really wish to pursue this beyond the class, which you're welcome to do, I have an article on this which I've reproduced online. It's my first proper article, actually, in 1998. Worries me sometimes that one of my best pieces is the first piece I produced. I'm worried I might actually be in decline, you know. But anyway, in fact, I've just been reading a memoir recently of Michael Golder that I was just talking about, and he regards his best article he ever wrote was in 1967, and he carried on publishing for 40 years afterwards, but he still says the best one was the one he produced then. Anyway, in the article I go through a whole run of examples of Matthew becoming fatigued with Mark, and then of Luke becoming fatigued with Mark. Very briefly, one of them is that the parable of the sower, Mark has the parable of the sower and follows it up with an interpretation explaining what all the different kinds of ground are. In Luke's version of the parable of the sower, he drops a lot of the details from Mark's story. But then when he gives the interpretation, where he's much closer to Mark, he reintroduces all the details he's dropped in the story. So it's like fatigue is operating. He's slightly more tired when he's doing the interpretation than when he's doing the actual parable. But a similar example to those ones we've just looked at from Matthew comes in Luke's version of the feeding of the 5,000. Because Luke relocates the feeding of the 5,000 away from the desert, which is where it is in Mark's Gospel, and he puts it in a city called Bethsaida. And you might think, well, that's okay, why not? Why not relocate it in a city? Well, then the bizarre thing happens that he then copies out almost verbatim from Mark, where the disciples say, we are here in a desert place. And the reader looks at it and the reader thinks, no, they're not. They're in a city. So the disciples say to Jesus, we are here in a desert place. And he says, send them out, all these people, into the surrounding villages so that they might find food and lodging. And you're thinking, why do you need, if you're in the middle of a city, to go to the surrounding villages to find food and lodging? The reason that he's saying this is he's taken it over from Mark. Because in Mark's Gospel, they're in the middle of a desert, and in Mark's Gospel, they're saying, look, send them out to the surrounding villages to go and get some food. And so what's happened is Luke has, if you like, taken over the wording of Mark in spite of the fact it doesn't cohere with his story. It makes much better sense to see this as Luke copying out of Mark, making an adjustment at the beginning of the story which is unable to sustain throughout. So what I did is I found a bunch of these examples like this, and there's lots more cases of this kind of thing. And then I said, let's look for reverse examples where Mark might be seen to have become fatigued with Matthew and Luke, and I can't find any. And in writing that article in 1998, 12 years ago, I said, look, actually I wrote it much longer ago than 98, but anyway, I said, look, find me some counterexamples. And in the 12 years it's intervened, I've not been persuaded by any of the counterexamples that people have brought forward. And therefore I think this is a genuine new argument for Markan priority. So that's where I stand on the issue. But if we've got Markan priority in place, we've still got a huge question that remains, and that's how do you explain that wedge of material, the double tradition, which is just in Matthew and Luke. And so next time we're going to ask where that material comes from. Did it come from a document that they both know called Q, or could it be that Luke copied directly from Matthew?
Thanks for joining me for this latest extended episode of the NT Pod. The third one in this series on the Synoptic Problem will be along soon, and that one will deal with the question of the existence of Q. You can find these and my regular NT Pods on the web at podacre, podacre.blogspot.com, or on Duke's iTunes U, or just Google for the NT Pod. Thanks again for listening, and I'll be with you again soon.